Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co host Ludwig von B. And today we're talking about music from Big Pink. This is the debut album by The Band. If you have not heard of them, yes, this is a band called The Band. Apparently, that caused some confusion when they got started. I think the idea is because after initially being, a small time act working with the rockabilly musician Ronnie Hawkins and being known as the Hawks, they transitioned into being Bob Dylan's backup band, at which point they were just called The Band. And then when they went solo, or I guess separate from Dylan, they became The Band. Though separate from Dylan is a bit of a stretch to say right here because Bob Dylan painted on the cover, and the songs themselves were recorded at this house that they called Big Pink somewhere in New York State, which was also the location of where the Basement Tapes were recorded. For those who don't know, the Basement Tapes is one of, you could call them the Bob Dylan bootleg recordings, except it's kind of risen to the mainstream. It's part of the Bob Dylan canon. It introduced one of the more important Bob Dylan songs in You Ain't Going Nowhere. So I was actually surprised when I listened to this because about a year ago I did a review of the Basement Tapes and I didn't realize how much overlap there was going to be between these two albums. Nonetheless, even as some of the songs were familiar, this album had a very much unique feel to the band itself. So the band consists of five guys. The one generally thought of as their leader is guitarist and songwriter Robbie Robertson, who occasionally sings, but not that often. Then you have drummer and quite frequent singer Levon Helm. He also plays the mandolin, but yeah, an unusual drummer who kind of serves as the visible frontman. You have Rick Danko, who plays the bass and also sings. And you have Richard Manuel, a piano player who also does quite a bit of singing. Based on this album alone, you'd think he was really the frontman of the record. And then you finally have pianist and organ player Garth Hudson, who I believe counted as the musical virtuoso of the group, even though he was the one who was a bit more in the background. He was the one with the most technical talent. So this truly is a team effort. They truly earn the name The Band because this is not like a lot of bands where, you know their lead singer and the lead singer also writes all the songs and basically it feels like a solo act that's billed as a band. No, this is 100% a team effort, and that team effort starts with track number 1, Tears of Rage. So as I said, Bob Dylan's influence is very much here, and Bob Dylan co-wrote the song Tears of Rage with Richard Manuel, who also does the lead vocal. Actually, I don't know, is it Manuel or Manuel? Anyway, I don't really know his heritage. But Richard Manuel, he has this very distinct voice. It sounds somewhere in between being pained and bemused, and it makes for a very interesting opening track. In fact, it says in the liner notes this is kind of an unusual song because conventional wisdom is you open an album with an upbeat song, and this is a largely mournful ballad. For a while, I was trying to interpret the lyrics. I was wondering, is there some kind of King Lear thing going on, some kind of American history? But I gradually got towards a more literal interpretation that this song is sung from the perspective of a father upset by his daughter, becoming distant from him. The band sort of view themselves as going against the grain, even as mainstream rock and roll was already going against the grain. One way in which they sort of rejected the rock and roll revolution is rather than going along with the F your parents ethic, they were very openly pro embracing your family. In fact, there's a picture in here of various members of the band with various generations of their various families. So I think this is just a very heartfelt song. These are relatively young guys, but imagining the pain of a parent watching their child grow distance from them. Track number 2 is called To Kingdom Come. This is written by Robbie Robertson, and the lead vocal is shared by Richard Manuel and Robbie Robertson. So this one is a bit more of a psychedelic flavor, but the subject matter is very similar to the previous song. Robbie Robertson's writing in particular feels really influenced by Bob Dylan. He likes to write these sort of lengthy, abstract musings that seem to be quite cynical about, not trusting anyone. You also again sense this we're not like other rock bands dynamic that here, and that there's kind of a religious tone to it. I don't think this is, a religious song. I don't think he's forcing Christianity on you. He's just interested in that aesthetic. Track number 3 is called In a Station, written by and lead vocals done by Richard Manuel. So this one brings in a kind of brighter keyboard sound, almost giving you a Beatles magical mystery tour feel to it. And it's a bit more hopeful in its subject matter. Also a bit religious feeling, but again, in a very abstract, God is nature, magic is in the air kind of way. Track 4 is an interesting lyrical construction. It's called The Caledonia Mission, written by Robbie Robertson, and the first vocal we get from Rick Danko. Kind of like Richard Manuel, Rick Danko has this very emotion-drenched voice, though there's something a bit more cartoonish about Rick Danko. He sounds kind of panicky, almost like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. So this is a song about having someone you love join this weird religious cult and being torn between trying to take an interest in their practice and also being horrified that they would get involved with it. Now, track number 5, one of the few songs I knew before listening to this record. I assume the band's most famous song. It's called The Wait, written by Robbie Robertson. Levon Helm, the drummer, is the main singer on this one, but Rick Danko comes in towards the end with his shaggy voice doing a verse of his own. So this is also, once again, a very Bob Dylan song in that it name drops various characters without really making clear who these characters are. You just have the sense that they have various mysterious quirks, and you can't quite tell if you're supposed to like them or not. And look, I mentioned earlier that cynicism, not trusting anyone, maybe having to turn to some kind of spirituality, and then becoming cynical about that too, are characteristics of Bob Dylan's songwriting. But another characteristic of Bob Dylan's songwriting is that he was a person who was very engaged with the world. He had all these connections. You can't become disillusioned with people and institutions unless you give them a chance in the first place. And that's kind of the vibe I get from this song. It's a song about meeting all these interesting people, and maybe you're asking for trouble by running into them and having to do favors or hang out with them, but at least you have all these experiences. And listening to this song with its vocals and harmony, the sort of teamwork of the shared lead vocal, the kind of classical vibrato, bright piano riffs in between, it's such a wonderful tune. Now, when I was reading about Robbie Robertson's influence behind this song, it seemed a bit more negative than I interpreted it. He said he was influenced by the Spanish filmmaker Luis Buñuel. Robertson's description of Buñuel's style in general is that they're about people, basically having to do a series of favors for others, and it shows the impossibility of living life as a saint. If you try to be good by everyone, try to be perfect, you're basically doomed to fail. But I wonder if the reason I interpret this song as optimistic, even if Robbie Robertson wrote it in this kind of pessimistic way, is maybe it only seems pessimistic if you're starting with religious presumptions. Like you think there's such a thing as a saint, a perfect human being who always does the right thing. Whereas if you don't think humans can be perfect, but you think they can be good, this does seem to be a song about someone being good, trying to do right by all these interesting, burdened people. Track number 6 is called We Can Talk, written by and lead vocal by Richard Manuel, with Levon Helm and Rick Danko helping with the vocals. It basically just feels like a playful country love/breakup song. Then we get a cover, the song Long Black Veil, with Rick Danko doing the lead vocals. This feels like a timeless song, but it's actually just a country tune from 1959 about a guy getting sentenced to death because he doesn't want to admit having an affair. It kind of fits with the broad tonal ambiguity of the rest of this album. It's simultaneously kind of folksy and maybe a little campy, while also mournful. And Danko's voice, like Richard Manuel's voice on some of the other tracks, it's like right in the emotional middle, whereas you can't tell if you're supposed to hear him as fully pained or just playing a role and being kind of campy. Track number 8 is called Chest Fever, a memorable title written by Robbie Robertson, though that's basically the music and the lyrics would have just been improvised and Richard Manuel ends up doing the lead vocal. This one sounds full-on psychedelic and maybe even a bit hard, metal-y, Zeppelin-y rock and roll, because it starts with this absolutely intense, loud organ. And the lyrics, they were just improvised over this psychedelic, not quite melodic, but certainly interesting groove. Then we get Lonesome Susie, the most sort of standard singer-songwritery thing, Richard Manuel composition and performance. And it's kind of similar to Cat Stevens' song, Sad Lisa, just engaging with the loneliness of an individual. Track number 10 is called This Wheel's on Fire, co-written again by Bob Dylan and also by Rick Danko, who does the lead vocal. I think what I read about this one is that Bob Dylan wrote the verses, and you can certainly hear his signature cynicism about an old friend in there. The recurring phrase in the song is, "If your memory serves you well." But then Rick Danko wrote the chorus, which might feel like a smaller contribution, but it's what gives the song its personality. And I guess Rick Danko also wrote the melody. And while we've seen Bob Dylan with this kind of cool, calm, collected, yeah, I'm so cynical man, Rick Danko adds this whole other level by adding this explosive anger, kind of saying, you know, how can anyone live their whole life with the cynicism that comes out in one Bob Dylan song after another? You know, if you're a heartfelt person, as Danko comes across as, at least in his singing voice, I have no idea what his personality was, you can only take so much cynicism before you explode. And then finally, we get track 11, I Shall Be Released. I previously thought of this as a Bob Dylan song, and indeed he is the sole songwriter, but I believe the band would have been the first one to have recorded it. And it sounds very weird if you're used to the Bob Dylan version, because Richard Manuel sings it entirely in a falsetto voice. And it's unusual, because I guess you're used to falsetto in doo-wop groups or with the Bee Gees, but not with like a kind of quasi-country group like the band. And it's a nice, thoughtfully optimistic way to end the record. You know, it has a duality to it where it kind of simultaneously says, we're all very small and insignificant, and the only way we'll be released from the absurdity of the world is with the ultimate finality of death. But it's also sung with this optimism that, you know, maybe the singer of the song believes something special will happen to them. They will rise above this wall, and you can't tell, is the rising this individual will rise above the challenges of life, or do they just mean one day we'll all die or go to heaven and it'll all be over? It's hard to tell, but it's a nice, gentle way to end the record, and it's kind of interesting that they do this in reverse. They start with the heaviness of Tears of Rage and end with the falsetto, spiritual gentleness of I Shall Be Released. So this CD version has a whole bunch of bonus tracks, and as I was saying at the beginning, that leads to even more overlap with the Bob Dylan album, The Basement Tapes, with songs like Yazoo Street Scandal and Katie's Been Gone and Orange Juice Blues thrown on here. It's not my practice to talk about the bonus tracks. I talk about the record in its traditional form. But yeah, this is an album with a lot of interesting stuff lyrically going on. Nothing that I quite go, yeah, I resonate this with. This is uniquely special, but it's just because overall it's just so competently made and such an unusual team effort. So if you haven't heard the band before, absolutely check this out. I'm Zach Morgenstern for Ludwig von B. See you next time.